There was a certain kind of morbid young genius that stalked the towns and cities of Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They felt deeply and dreamed more deeply still. They composed poems and stories, aestheticized death and decay, forged literary movements that broke new artistic ground. Often they died young, leaving decomposing bodies of work from which black and incandescent flowers spring. One such young genius was the German writer and poet Georg Heym. Around 7 or 8 years ago, when I first visited Lower Silesia, a region that's become my favorite part of Poland, I was planning a visit to Jelenia Góra and happened to read a few days before that its former German name was Hirschberg, the birthplace of Georg Heym, who was one of the writers who most fascinated me at the time. Until that moment, I hadn't realized that it was one and the same place, though perhaps I should have worked it out from the fact that their names are direct translations of one another. In any case, I was thrilled to be walking the streets and breathing in the air that had nourished Heym's young imagination, an imagination whose fruits would ripen swiftly and just as soon fall to the earth and rot. During my time in Silesia, I thought much of the young poet whose life was cut tragically short during an accident on the river Havel, which runs through the west of Berlin. Heym had gone skating on the frozen river with a friend and fellow author, Ernst Balke. Evidence suggests that the surface had begun to split. Balke had fallen through, and that Heym died in a brave attempt to save his friend from plunging into the black and freezing waters. On coming back home, I returned to Heym's posthumously published collection Der Dieb, or The Thief, from 1913. There is an English version available, translated by Susan Bennett, but I've never managed to lay my hands on it, so I was forced to read it in the original. On this reading, I was particularly captivated by the short poetic sketch Dissection, and decided to try my hand at rendering it into English. We'll hear the German text with my English version in the subtitles. Any inelegance of phrasing or inaccuracies are my own. From time to time, I'll pause to offer my own reflections on the text.
Der Tote lag allein und nackt auf einem weißen Tisch in dem großen Saal, in dem bedrückenden Weiß, der grausamen Nüchternheit des Operationssaales, in dem noch die Schreie unendlicher Qualen zu zittern schienen. Die Mittagssonne bedeckte ihn und ließ auf seiner Stirn die toten Flecken aufwachen. Sie zauberte aus seinem nackten Bauch ein helles Grün und blähte ihn auf wie einen großen Wassersack. Sein Leib glich einem riesigen, schillernden Blumenkelch, einer geheimnisvollen Pflanze aus indischen Urwäldern, die jemand schüchtern vor den Altar des Todes gelegt hatte. Prächtige rote und blaue Farben wuchsen an seinen Lenden entlang, und in der Hitze barst langsam wie eine rote Ackerfurche die große Wunde unter seinem Nabel, die einen furchtbaren Duft ausströmte.
Heym is primarily known as an expressionist writer, and surely this is evident in the dark, subjective moods and atmospheres of his poetry. But this text strikes me as having a lot in common with decadent writing, the fetishizing of decay, the elevation of decomposition into a creative or magical force, the conjuring of that gangrenous bright green, the transformation of the rotting of the body into a sacrificial gift in honor of some distant pagan deity in exotic climes. The imagery calls to mind a reversal of the descriptions of flowers in Against Nature, whose stems resemble the stumps of amputated limbs, or seem ravaged by syphilis or leprosy.
Die Ärzte traten ein. Ein paar freundliche Männer in weißen Kitteln mit Schmissen und goldenen Zwickern. Sie traten an den Toten heran und sahen ihn sich an, mit Interesse, unter wissenschaftlichen Gesprächen. Sie nahmen aus den weißen Schränken ihr Sezierzeug heraus, weiße Kästen voll von Hämmern, Knochensägen mit starken Zähnen, Pfeilen, grässliche Batterien voll von Pinzetten, kleine Bestecke voll riesiger Nadeln, die wie krumme Geierschnäbel ewig nach Fleisch zu schreien schienen. Sie begannen ihr grässliches Handwerk. Sie glichen furchtbaren Folterknechten. Über ihre Hände strömte das Blut, und sie tauchten sie immer tiefer in den kalten Leichnam ein und holten seinen Inhalt heraus, weißen Köchen gleich, die eine Gans ausnehmen. Um ihre Arme wanden sich die Därme, grün-gelbe Schlangen, und der Kot trof auf ihre Kittel, eine warme, faulige Flüssigkeit. Sie stachen die Blase auf. Der kalte Harn schimmerte darin wie gelber Wein. Sie schütteten ihn in große Schalen, und er stank scharf und beizend wie Salmiak.
The entrance of the physicians, their mixture of brutality and cold scientific objectivity, relegates the corpse from the status of art object to clinical subject, or perhaps even carcass on the butcher's slab. It also cuts a dividing line through the center of the text, which demarcates two entirely different ways of seeing. On one side of this dividing line, the dead man can be viewed as a human being of rich experience, an exalted body from which the life has fled, but which is worthy of deep attention and the respect of the artist's eye. On the other, the body is a material thing to be studied, probed, disassembled, and destroyed. The German word Sektion is derived from the Latin verb seccare, literally to cut through or split. For me, the word's resonance in this text refers to more than simply the dissection of the body. It also refers to two incompatible ways of viewing reality, one generously attentive, the other detached and dispassionate. In Heym's text, the former view wins out unequivocally, in death and in sleep.
Aber der Tote schlief. Er ließ sich geduldig hin und her zerren, an seinen Haaren hin und her raufen. Er schlief. Und während die Schläge der Hämmer auf seinem Kopf dröhnten, wachte ein Traum, ein Rest von Liebe in ihm auf, wie eine Fackel, die hinein in seine Nacht leuchtete. Vor dem großen Fenster tat sich ein großer, weiter Himmel auf, gefüllt von kleinen weißen Wölkchen, die in dem Lichte schwammen, in der Nachmittagsstille, wie kleine weiße Götter. Und die Schwalben kreisten hoch oben im Blau, zitternd in der warmen Julisonne. Das schwarze Blut des Todes rann über die blaue Fäulnis seiner Stirn. Es verdunstete in der Hitze zu einer schrecklichen Wolke, und die Verwesung des Todes kroch mit ihren bunten Krallen über ihn hin. Seine Haut begann auseinander zu fließen. Sein Bauch wurde weiß wie der eines Aales unter den gierigen Fingern der Ärzte, die in dem feuchten Fleisch ihre Arme bis an die Ellenbogen badeten.
As the intensity of the physician's brutality increases, so too does the expansiveness of the dead man's world. We move away gradually from the blood and gore of the operating theatre, and our gaze is turned inward. The internal dreamscape, moment by moment, overwhelms the waking world until the dream's reality supplants it altogether, and yet Heym's conviction forces us to ask ourselves why its reality would ever have been in question.
Die Verwesung zog den Mund des Toten auseinander. Er schien zu lächeln. Er träumte von einem seligen Gestirn, von einem duftenden Sommerabend. Seine zerfließenden Lippen zitterten wie unter einem flüchtigen Kusse. wie ich dich liebe. Ich habe dich so geliebt. Soll ich dir sagen, wie ich dich liebe? Wie du durch die Mondfelder gingest, selber eine duftende Mohnflamme, hattest du den ganzen Abend in dich getrunken. Und dein Kleid, das um deine Knöchel bauschte, war wie eine Welle von Feuer in der untergehenden Sonne. Aber dein Kopf neigte sich in dem Licht, und dein Haar brannte noch und flammte von allen meinen Küssen. So gingest du dahin und sahst dich immer nach mir um, und die Laterne in deiner Hand schwankte wie eine glühende Rose lange noch fort in der Dämmerung. Ich werde dich morgen wiedersehen, hier unter dem Fenster der Kapelle, hier, wo das Licht der Kerzen herausfällt und dein Haar in einen goldenen Wald verwandelt, hier, wo sich die Narzissen an deine Knöchel schmiegen, zärtlich wie zarte Küsse. Ich werde dich wiedersehen, alle Abende um die Stunde der Dämmerung. Wir werden uns nie verlassen, wie ich dich liebe. Soll ich dir sagen, wie ich dich liebe? Und der Tote zitterte leise vor Seligkeit auf seinem weißen toten Tisch, während die eisernen Meißel in den Händen der Ärzte die Knochen seiner Schläfe aufbrachen.
When Georg Heym's young body was found under the frozen ice sheets of the Havel, one wonders what kind of treatment it received. Was it a generous or clinical gaze that fell upon it? The American poet Peter Viereck, in his article Ogling Through Ice, the Sullen Lyricism of Georg Heym, describes the immediate aftermath of his death. He writes, "For sheer gruesomeness, few scenes can vie with that of Heym in the morgue. His corpse was stretched out between two unnamed strangers. The first was a mangled suicide, scraped up from the railroad tracks. The second stranger was a drowned fisherman, ensconced like one of his fish in a solid block of ice. Though in a coffin, Heym too was still frozen so ice-like that his complexion stayed ruddy and his features lively. Observers were particularly upset by the bitter expression of his lips, twisted by the horror of 15 minutes of continuous screaming for help to onlookers. The latter dared not venture near enough with ropes or ladders. In the morgue, some hack pastor, knowing nothing of Heym, intoned conventional pieties over this convention-rejecting and anti-religious poet. Thereupon, Heym looked as if he wanted to jump up to crack the pastor's skull open, to quote an eyewitness. Later, Heym's rather Art Nouveau chums went dancing round the body, waving garlands and dutifully reciting Hölderlin. For all the gruesomeness of this scene in the morgue, two factors must mitigate its coldness and horror. The first is that Heym's friends surely shared his artistic veneration of the body, and the second is that whichever pathologist handled the case had enough imagination, or who knows, perhaps ironically enough scientific objectivity, to recognize Heym's final act as one of generosity, bravery, and love, to recognize his body's final loving dream, and add it to those he dreamed through his poems, and to the ones that awaken within us every time as readers we open ourselves to his words. Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite morbid young writer or poet, and if you'd like me to continue sharing translations or readings like this one. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The support really means a lot to me. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.